I know you did Orange and Brown Talk podcast. You had the NFL Network analyst, former executive Marc Ross, who was the guy that said the Browns might be the most complete roster in the NFL. Take us through some of that and some of the rationale behind what he was thinking when he made that list where the Browns were so high.
Well, I think sometimes in the NFL we can think roster and we just think quarterback, like how good's your quarterback? And I think one of the points that Marc Ross made that was important is listen, he's not saying Baker Mayfield's better than Patrick Mahomes or Tom Brady, which were the teams that he had the Chiefs and the Bucs second and third on that list. But Baker Mayfield is in range of those guys, right? There's not a hole at quarterback for the Browns. And so then when you look at everything else, and that's not a shot at Baker, but it's just saying okay, well, he's a top 10, 12 quarterback. And then when you factor everything else in, it allows you to put Browns at number one in a ranking like this, which I think is really smart. And I think one of the big things that Mark and I talked about on the podcast is just that we all see it. There's not a gaping hole with the Browns, our defensive tackle or linebacker, but they're still going to rotate. I think at least 4 guys they believe in at both those spots. And I think there's, clearly some top end talent at multiple spots, but I think it's really the lack of a hole and the fact that Baker allows you to consider something like this because you believe in him and you aren't going into the season with the big question mark at the most important position.
The other thing about the Browns roster is there's some depth there for really the first time in a long time. There are going to be guys that don't make this roster who are almost immediately snapped up by other teams in the league, I think.
That'll be a fun way to judge that, right, Dave, when we get to that point in camp when they're making roster cuts, and usually when you're the Browns, and it still might be the case, but usually it's they're making their roster. It's well, everybody's doing their roster projections at the end of camp, and it's well, save 2 or 3 spots for the guys they signed that get cut somewhere else because they could use some help. And I do think you're right, but I think the main point of that is, when you look, and Odell Beckham's absence is proof of that he missed half of last season and it didn't kill him because they had Rashard Higgins ready to go, because they had Donovan Peoples-Jones as a rookie who could fill in and help the team. And I think the depth at tight end, the depth at receiver, the depth at running back, the depth at safety, there's some places where they don't have as much depth, but, I think their backup offensive linemen are okay. Some of those young guys have to come along. If you had multiple guys on the offensive line who are out, I think all of a sudden you wouldn't feel too good anymore. But I do think that is an important point. You can't be top heavy, right? I mean, you're not going to be number one on a ranking like this just because you have 5 or 6 stars. It really is not just 1 through 22, but 1 through 44. And I think in that regard, the Browns stack up.